right. Boy, those commercials are painless for you. You gotta love that. You're listening to America's Voice. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host here, and we're gonna tap into a very unusual but interesting study. And it's one that has gotten, no real press. Isn't that surprising? Wow. There's a new study out from Princeton and Northwestern universities. And what's interesting about it is that these two schools of higher learning, if you will, would ordinarily not be construed to be on the conservative side of the political ideological fence. If anything, they would fall under the liberal bastion category. Princeton and Northwestern have declared the U.S. government is no longer a republic, it is now an oligarchy. Now, let's define oligarchy for a minute so that we understand what that is. An oligarchy, and the term originates from the Russian Duma and the takeover of the Tsarist republic or Tsarist monarchy, I should say, back in 1917. And the idea of an oligarchy is that you have a small collective entourage of people that run a government for their own purposes, for their own advancement, their own personal improvement, feathering their own nests, if you will, with both power and money. And an oligarchy is different than a dictatorship, because a dictatorship is traditionally one person with a small group of advisors, or a family, if you will, that runs a nation. And all of it, of course, involves the key operative word of tyranny, but that goes without saying. Or as we used to say when I was back in the East, that goes without saying. So the concept here is that an oligarchy, or alternatively referred to as a corporitocracy, is an important word for you to understand. Because a corporitocracy and an oligarchy are more closely allied or aligned than would be a dictatorship. A dictatorship is a government that is run by an individual or a family, whereas an oligarchy and a corporitocracy are more like a fascist co-joining of government and industry or business. This study is very clear that the United States government more closely resembles an oligarchy or a corporitocracy than a republic or a democracy. The researchers from this study did, and it's rather lengthy, they reviewed 2,000 policy changes. Now, notice that these are policy changes, not laws. And here's where we're going to get into the thick of this thing, because I want you to recognize and understand utilizing your critical thinking skills. And I posted this article. It's from Ben Swan. And, of course, there's a link to the actual study itself from Princeton EDU. But the important thing is that I want you to understand that policy is not law. And yet, policy parades about as law, carries all the weight of law, and yet doesn't have the provenance of law. What do I mean by that? Okay. Law can only be passed, according to our own Constitution, by Congress. Right? Provenance of law shows, like the provenance of art or the provenance of a manuscript is a chain of command, if you were, or not, a chain of possession. So it shows the historical record of ownership or existence. Where did it come from? How was it born? what is the authority or the assurance that that is genuine? That's provenance, right? When you look at a piece of art, you go back to that art and you say, the provenance of this art is that it has been established as legitimate, it's not a fraud, it's not a fake, it's not a forgery, and we can prove that not only because we've had, experts look at it and review it and say, yes, these are original pigments that were used back in the time of the great artist, and by comparing it, but also in addition to that, we can show the chain of ownership that establishes that this is a legitimate piece of art and its provenance. Policy changes are forgeries, if you will, of law. This study reviewed and examined 2,000 policy changes that have been in place since 1981 to 2002. And they compared the changes to the preferences of average Americans, the wealthy citizenry, and interests and lobbyist groups. Here's what they found out. They were looking to find the answers on who actually is it that's in charge of the country. I mean, who supports and controls, if you will, the nation? Who rules? And to what extent is the principle of the consent of the governed honored? Well, guess what? We lose, which should come as no surprise to you, but we lose. They analyzed 4 theoretical traditions in American politics, and I don't want to get into the weeds on this. I'm going to review it with you briefly, but I don't want to get into the weeds of looking at what each of these contains. But these 4 principles and theoretical traditions are called majoritarian electoral democracy, economic elite domination, and 2 different types of interest groups, one called majoritarian pluralism and biased pluralism. So basically, the researcher, or one of the researchers, sums it up this way. The central point that emerges from our research is that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impact on U.S. government policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence. Wow. Average citizens, even mass-based interest groups, have little or no independent influence. If you want proof that the eco-terrorists who are and eco-tyrants who are ravaging our land, when I say ravaging our land, I mean ravaging the property rights of individuals. If you want proof that these are not mass-based interest groups, but are specifically a portion of these interests and lobbyist groups which are run by corporations. See, and the political elite. Realize something. The mass-based interest groups in the United States don't have any power, nor do the average citizens. The mass-based interest groups are other groups, not the eco. Here's a perfect example. How many people in the United States would think that having the ability to label our food as to whether or not it contains a genetically modified organism is a good thing? I mean, the average person would look at that and say, sure, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be on the label that this contains something that I may find that I don't want to participate in, or I may find I don't think is healthy for me. And yet, we cannot get labeling implemented here in the United States of America. Why? Because it's a mass-based interest group of the general population, of the average citizens. And it has little or no influence and power over what really happens. However, ConAgra, Monsanto, Dow, Syngenta, all of these companies, they all have massive influence, which they bought with money. The evidence that they find in this study supports the theories of economic elite domination and biased pluralism, but not for theories of majoritarian electoral democracy or majoritarian pluralism. The key difference in the theories is the power and influence that wealthy individuals yield versus the average or the median voter. So here's what you need to recognize that comes out of this. We, as a collective group of individuals, including general mass interests in interest groups within the voter base that don't have a wealthy corporate backing, we have zero power. Doesn't matter what we collectively think is good or bad. What matters is whether or not you've got the money to pay Congress to institute your unique vision of what the country should be. That's why you have these environmentalists who are able to accomplish, even though they are a very, very small minority, amazing things like the protection of a tortoise in the middle of a desert that is actually enhanced by the feeding of cattle, not reduced. You see, they have an enormous amount of money behind them for one purpose: to implement the concepts and the principles and the tenets of the Agenda 21 goals that have been outlined for us in writing since the 60s. The idea that massive areas of the United States should be left to go back to wildlands, if you will, while humanity, in its collective destructiveness, is collected into these small, population centers where, one, we are easily controlled and the damage that we can accomplish is, limited, shall we say. You see, here's the problem. We as a collective group can get together all we want, but unless we're willing to back up our demands with what? Force, then we are voiceless. I'm going to clarify for you in just 1 minute what I mean by that. But I want you to hear the next paragraph in this statement, in this article from Swan. This is on Ben Swan, by the way. Despite past researchers suggesting that policy changes are the result of, quote, collective preferences, end quote, or that liberalism and conservatism in politics is representative of the views of citizens, the Princeton study suggests, quote, that reality is best captured by mixed theories in which both individual economic elites and organized interest groups, including corporations largely owned and controlled by the same wealthy elites, play a substantial part in affecting public policy. But the general public has little or no independent influence. The researchers' findings indicate that when a majority of citizens disagree with the economic elite and call for policy change, they rarely get it. They blame, quote, the strong status quo bias built in to the U.S. political system. Now, let me clarify for you what I meant when I said the only way for us to evoke change, to force change upon a federal government that, quite frankly, doesn't heed our request or even our demands for change. Remember that the general public has little or no independent influence until we do what? We begin to back our demand for change with force. Why is that? Because government is force, and it only knows and respects and responds to force. Now, what does that mean for us? It means that we need to change the tactics that we use in order to restore our national government back to its constitutional guidelines and put the Constitution in its rightful place as the document that limits government. Remember, the Constitution is not a limiting document based on our limitations. It's a document intended to limit government, to bind men down with the Constitution, the chains of the Constitution. That was Jefferson. That's not me. Jefferson recognized and saw that the only way for the American people to retain a level of control over the force of government, to keep the fire contained within the fireplace, if you will, right? To keep the campfire contained within the circle of rocks, is by utilizing force. Because he contends himself, George Washington stated for us emphatically that government is force. It's the only thing that government is. It's not reason, and it's like fire. It can be helpful, but it is also very, very dangerous. And now we see that because we have not instituted a circle of rocks, a framework of brick to contain that fire, we have lost control of it. And it is burning down our house. The only way for us to regain control of that force, and in this case to follow the analogy of fire, is to douse it, to put it out. How do we do that? Well, for starters, we starve it. We starve it of fuel, and we starve it of food. Fuel is its food. Its food and its fuel are you, money, and your apathy and your acquiescence. When you cease to be willing to go along with what you know to be wrong, when you cease to continue to allow your money to be used to essentially create your own demise, then and only then will we be able to make an impact and see the fire begin to recede. We have to use force, however, to control it. We have to begin to douse it. We have to begin to starve it of fuel. In addition to that, there are times when just starving it of fuel is not enough. I'll give you an example. When you look at a fire in a wild scenario where it's in a large forest, what does forest ranger or forest firefighters do? They cut what's called a fire break, right? They go in there with a bulldozer and they just plow a road. And the idea is that if we can get this road to act as a fire break, that the fire won't continue to spread in that direction. Now, oftentimes they're successful. Sometimes they're not. The goal is to create a disruption so that the fire can't continue to grow along the ground. Sometimes the fire leaps over the fire break. And you see, we've been attempting to put fire breaks in our society now for a very, very long time. But we've been trying to do it the wrong way. We've been trying to do it by a general public outcry and protesting, which doesn't matter because politicians don't get their bribes paid by your voice. They get their bribes paid for by a corporitocracy who's willing to put their money where they want the politician's mouth to be. The fire breaks we've attempted have been done with a snow shovel when they need to be done with a road grader or a plow. We need to starve the fire of fuel. And there are times, and I'm going to use the perfect example of the Bundy Ranch scenario, when force applied appropriately and in measured response can be a very, very valuable tool. You see, even when we, as a majority, we demand economic change, or we demand policy change, or we demand a change in the behavior of those allegedly called their representatives, we very, very rarely get it, because we cannot compete with the economic elite, with the corporitocracy. So there are a couple of other measures that we can do that will bring the fight to them. What is that? Well, for starters, we can start going after the corporations themselves. What do I mean by that? Well, there are a significant number of corporations in the United States of America that create products and services which are diametrically opposed to your freedom. I submit to you the companies that produce the products that are used to spy on you, to build cameras that are used to leech revenue from you. I'm just throwing some examples out there. There are many of them, thousands of them. There are massive companies out there who you buy their products, and then they take the profits and they bribe Congress to do that which is against your best interest. Starve them as well. I got to wrap this because we're at the very end of this, and I want to finish this article. There was a telling quote that concludes the study. And here's what it is. We believe that if policymaking is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans, then America's claim to being a democratic society are seriously threatened. Here's what you need to recognize. I expect politicians to be corrupt because they always have been, and because power corrupts and money is an easy way to achieve that. So what I'm suggesting, America, is that you rethink the issue and we start applying our efforts not necessarily towards protesting government, but we apply our efforts towards stripping the corporitocracy of the resources to continue to bribe them, and we apply measured force legitimately and authoritatively where it's necessary. That will be the beginning of a change in how government responds to us, because we will be building, one, the fire break, and two, we will have the tools at hand to be able to douse that fire, pull away its fuel, and starve it to death. I've got to tell you, we're out of time as a nation. And whether or not you perceive or choose to understand and recognize the exigent danger that we're in, the danger close danger that we are in, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It only means that we're going to have to strategize uniquely and differently, or we're going to lose this war. And I've got to tell you something, folks. It's time you began to look at this for what it is. This is a war. It is a war for the future of our nation. It's sad, but it's true. The question becomes, will we continue to stand in line like the British soldiers of old and await our death by a volley of bullets flying up at us? Or will we get smart and, like the colonists, determine that we can do this in a much better fashion via the guerrilla warfare method? Aha! Therein, ladies and gentlemen, therein lies the truth. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to tackle our third topic. The IRS is tracking your vehicle now. Huh? You're kidding, right? No, I'm not. We'll be right back. You're listening to America's Voice Now.